So first of all, thank you for all the attendees who've already shown up for this webinar. This webinar tonight is hosted by Free Talk Live for Liberty First University. I'm Roger Paxton. I'm a co-host with Free Talk Live and the host of the Lava Flow podcast, and I'll also be your host for this evening. Really quickly, let me deal with the legal stuff first. These webinars are a commercial offering of Free Talk Live intended as a service to its listeners. Any statements made during the webinar are the words of the person, KrisAnne Hall, and any entities making those statements are not a statement of Free Talk Live necessarily. Also, as I mentioned, there will be a Q&A segment toward the end of the webinar. So as you have those questions, please send them to the chat window, the Q&A window of this webinar, and we'll be sure to get those questions to KrisAnne towards the end of the webinar. So I don't want to waste any more of your time, so I'm going to introduce Liberty First University and KrisAnne. Liberty First University is a unique education in the history and the application of the Constitution of the United States. The Constitution is rooted in ideas much older than 1776, and it's the goal of Liberty First University to teach people the full history of American freedom so that you can better appreciate just how much liberty has been lost since the founding of our country. For over 7 years, they've been traveling and teaching across America, averaging 260 classes in over 22 states every single year. Now, these classes are perfect for individuals, groups, K-12 and college classrooms, churches, and anywhere else where people are hungry for knowledge. And now the courses are available online for everyone to use. KrisAnne Hall is the president of Liberty First University, and she began her career as a biochemist, a Russian linguist for the U.S. Army, and a prosecutor for the state of Florida. KrisAnne has also practiced First Amendment law for a prominent national nonprofit law firm, so she knows what she's talking about. KrisAnne is the author of 6 books on the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. She also has a nationally syndicated radio show and a cable television show. KrisAnne has been featured on C-SPAN TV and C-SPAN Book TV. KrisAnne can connect the dots for you about the Constitution like no one else can. So KrisAnne is a disabled Army veteran, a mother, a pastor's wife, and a patriot. KrisAnne lives in North Florida with her husband, JC, an evangelist. He's also a missionary to Haiti and a former Russian instructor for the U.S. Navy, and their adopted son, Colton. So KrisAnne, I'm going to pass this on over to you. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much. And I want to thank Free Talk Live for having me here. And I want to thank everybody who has joined us. This really is the passion of my life, to teach this. And I've been doing it now for, my goodness, I guess January will be going on 10 years. And traveling across America, like you said, for the last 7 years, averaging about 260 classes in over 22 states every single year. We have had the privilege of meeting so many people. I mean, I've taught classes, middle school, high school students. I've taught the legislators of 10 states. I have a law enforcement class that offers continuing education credits for law enforcement, all on the Constitution, political groups, business groups. I got to actually teach a national convention of surgeons and pediatricians, which was really cool, because they understood that the Constitution is not political. And that's something that we really have to overcome in America. This idea that the Constitution and the education on the Constitution is political. It is not. It's essential. It's who we are, and it's who our government is supposed to be. And because we have this preconceived notion that the Constitution is political, that old idiom, we can't talk about politics in religion, in public company. And so we don't talk about the things that actually matter the most. As a matter of fact, America's principles of liberty, built on freedom of speech and freedom of press and the right to peaceably assemble and freedom of religion, that was to encourage the American people to talk about politics and religion in public. And so the ideas that we've been sort of trained, and if you will, in some cases even brainwashed into believing we're not allowed to talk about these things, are the things that keep the American people disengaged, that keep us from the true power source that we have. As I've traveled across the country, I see a lot of political activism. but so much of it is really misguided. I meet people who believe that they've been trained in the Constitution when really, in fact, they haven't. Our Constitution and its education, I would say the education on our Constitution, has been fundamentally transformed since the year 1833. We stopped teaching accurate education on who our government is and how our Constitution is supposed to work in 1833. So unless, people out there in America have been trained before 1833, then the education that they've received is tainted at best. So that's why we started traveling and teaching across America, and that's why we created Liberty First University, because Liberty First University brings to the American people an education on the Constitution as if the founders themselves would be teaching it, but at a level where the American people can understand it, right? So in a place where you try to read the Federalist Papers, the Anti-Federalist Papers, and because their style of writing and their style of language is so different than ours today, this is what we do at Liberty First University. We break these things down in such a way that everybody can understand it. I mean, we have middle school kids. I teach a 5-hour seminar on Saturdays where I have had 5, 6, 7-year-olds sit for the entire 5 and 6 hours just because it is so compelling. I mean, it really is a very passionate kind of education. And so we have homeschool parents all over the country that are members of Liberty First University, supplementing their children's education, whether they're homeschooled, private schooled, or public schooled. Everybody's starting to realize that the education on government and the education on the Constitution is sorely lacking in America.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree more with that. As a homeschooler myself, I homeschool my 2 boys. Even in, more constitutionally based homeschooling systems, there still seems to be a lack of a really big history behind why these things happen the way they did. And that's one thing that your course does. It actually goes through the 800 years of British legal history prior to the Constitution. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So that is one of the courses at Liberty First University. We have, my goodness, I don't even have count anymore. We have over 30 courses. And all of the courses are actually, you stream them at your own pace. The majority of them actually also have workbooks that you can download and go through it. I always tell people we're not a degree, we don't give degrees like paid universities do. We do better than the paid universities. We actually give you an education. And so what we do, this teaching that you're talking about, the history of the Constitution, is one of the first things that I think is essential for the American people to reconnect with. Number one, that our Constitution is not an invention of our founders of 1776 or 1789. It took 700 years to write our Constitution. There's absolutely nothing new, nothing novel in our Constitution. Everything the product of 700 years of not just simply British law, but the struggle of the British people with their government to secure the liberty of the people and limit their government. Most people don't realize the British government has a very unique kind of monarchy. It's called a limited monarchy. And that limited monarchy began in the year 1014, when the people decided that they were going to control their king. And they established an agreement with a king named Ethelred and said, look, we'll make a deal with you. We'll allow you to be our king on one condition. Your only job is to help us organize for our common defense, which should sound familiar to us who have read the preamble to the Constitution. And your only job is to organize us for our common defense and to negotiate with foreign kingdoms, peace, trade, war. You are to leave us alone to govern ourselves in our small communities. This right here, this Ethelred Agreement of 1014, is the very foundation for our constitutional republic. When our states created the Constitution, which created the federal government, it's all built on that foundation, that the purpose of the federal government is limited and defined. James Madison wrote in Federalist 45, he said, the powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined. Those that remain in the states are numerous and indefinite. That's the Ethelred Agreement. The entire purpose for creating the federal government was limited to the very specific enumerated powers that can be very generally described as organizing us for our common defense and foreign affairs. The entire purpose of the federal government is simply to be an ambassador on behalf of the states in foreign affairs, and the limitation of power enumerated in the articles combined with the Supremacy Clause, combined with the 10th Amendment, tells us that the federal government's powers are external and the state's powers are internal. But we don't teach that.
Right.
And I don't think you find that. I don't think you find that even in private school education, because, like I said, the majority of our training on the Constitution has been changed since 1833. And the major point of change is the relationship between the states and the federal government. And in 1833, that was by design. There was a movement of federal supremacy that swept through America to undermine the established check and balance of the people through the states on their federal government and establish this errant ideology that you will hear everywhere from professors and lawyers and judges and politicians, that the Supremacy Clause makes the federal government supreme to the states. That's not what the Supremacy Clause says, and that's not what it does.
Gotcha. Well, that's absolutely fascinating. Thanks for answering that question. It sounds like the way that you're talking about this, that the Constitution is almost like a contract between the federal government and the parties, which are the states. Is that what you're talking about here?
Well, it is more than like a contract. It actually is a contract, but it is not a contract between the states and the federal government. And I'll explain to you why that's a temporal impossibility. The Constitution is actually a contract between the states that creates the federal government. So in contract law terms, when people get together and they negotiate a contract and they sign that contract into legal being, those people are called the parties to the contract. That's what you said. But for our terms, our Constitution is not actually a contract. It's a specific kind of contract called a compact. And a compact, by legal definition, is an agreement between legally sovereign governments. The only legally sovereign governments that existed prior to the ratification of the Constitution were the states. And we know this through the Declaration of Independence. We know this through the creation of the states, through the Lee Resolution in 1776. And we know that the states are the parties to the contract. We also know from history. We also know from just simple logical thinking, because some people will say, well, KrisAnne, the people are the party to the Constitution. Well, that's not true either. And you know that as well. We just don't connect the dots properly. Let me ask you a question, Raj. How was the Constitution ratified? Was it ratified by popular vote of the people?
Of course not. It was ratified by the legislature of the states.
That's right, by the delegates from the states. And because it was ratified by the delegates of the states and not by popular vote, we know, legally speaking, the people are not a party to the compact. The states are the party to the compact. Now, what many people may know or may not know is that there was a very precarious moment when we didn't have enough states to ratify, because we had to have 3/4 of the states in agreement to create the legally binding contract of the Constitution. And much of the conversation prior to the ratification was, look, if we don't have the number of states to ratify, do you know what happens? The union never happens. The federal government never happens. Nothing ever happens. So we know from that fact that the federal government did not exist until the Constitution was ratified, which makes the federal government the product of the contract.
Gotcha.
You cannot be a party to the contract if you are the product of the contract, because you can't sign the contract into legal being if you do not exist until it's signed. So knowing that, using Occam's razor, if you will, and eliminating all the possibilities, we are left with only one legal conclusion, that the states are the parties to the constitutional compact. The states created the Constitution. The Constitution created the federal government, which means the states are the creators of the federal government. And what's crazy, Raj, we don't teach this. You know why we don't teach this? Because this is the solution to all our problems in the federal government. This is the most powerful ultimate check and balance on federal power. This understanding that the states are the creators of the federal government. James Madison actually describes it in 1800 as the greatest power on earth, the state's authority to check and balance its creation.
So, since you're saying that the people here obviously did not ratify the Constitution, they were not a party of its contract and its creation. How do the people fit into that? How do their rights fit into it? How do their constitutional rights fit in?
Okay, well, that's you've got like two questions there. So let's kind of start at the beginning. Where do the people fit in? The people fit in this way. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just power from the consent of the governed. If you read the first part of the Declaration of Independence, and then you read the last paragraph of the Declaration of Independence, you understand the people are the creators of the states. Through the creation of the states then acted as representatives of the people in the ratification of the Constitution. Understanding natural law. Samuel Adams wrote in 1772, among the natural rights of the colonists are these: first, life; secondly, liberty; third, property, together with the right to protect and defend them in the best manner possible. Our rights are not government derived. Our rights don't come from the Constitution. That's why it's really a misnomer to say that we have constitutional rights. There is not a single person in America with constitutional rights, because your rights don't come from the Constitution. They are natural rights. They are inherent rights. They precede the Constitution. The whole purpose of the Constitution is to secure our rights. And so that's where the people come in. The people have the ultimate authority to create government for the securing of their rights, which means the people have the ultimate authority over their government. Now let me explain how this works, because somebody might be saying, okay, well, that's great, Chrisanne, why do we need the states? Here's the reality. Our founders, before the creation of our constitutional republic, were subjects in a kingdom. Which means if they had trouble with the central government, they had to stand on their front porch with their sword or their musket and battle the government alone. And they knew what that was like. They knew what it was like to try to control a federal government, for them, the parliament and the king, with no community authority. The creation of our constitutional republic was to be the ultimate check and balance, so the people could have a central government that they could control, and they would never have to be alone in doing it. The states are the representatives of the people in the control of the federal government. So when the federal government leaps over its constitutional boundaries, when the federal government tries to exercise more power that's then has been delegated. What's interesting, our founders actually anticipated this day. They wrote about it. They wrote about what happens when the federal government no longer is bound by the Constitution. See, one of our failings in modern ideology is that the Constitution stops the federal government or controls the federal government. It does not. James Madison referred to the Constitution as a parchment barrier. It's a piece of paper with ink on it. The Constitution itself has no power. And if the people don't control their government, then the government has no control at all. And we can't rely on the government to check and balance itself, because then you're left with the kingdom again. So the whole purpose, the structure of the constitutional republic, where the people create the state, which is a community of the people coming together in one accord with the securing of their rights based on common principles of that community. The states then came together as their own community, a union, not a consolidation of power, but a confederation of power to create the federal government. So when the federal government, remember, whose power is principally upon organizing for common defense and for foreign affairs, steps outside of its boundaries and tries to infringe on the rights of the people or impose or usurp the power of the states, the people are no longer alone. They no longer have to stand on their front porch with their sword or their musket and fight the king alone. That's the state's job. But because, Raj, we have failed to teach the truth for so long about our Constitution, we have been robbed of that enormous power that we have. And you know what's crazy? I know I'm right. I absolutely know that I'm right. I know that I'm hitting the nail right on the head. I know that this is, in fact, the power of the people, because I am under constant attack by those who love big power in government, those who want kingdoms again. See, we went through a coup of our government in 1776, but we didn't change the culture completely. So since 1776, when we threw off our government, we still had people in the American states now who wanted kingdoms, right? They want to be taken care of. They don't care if that means they don't get power over their property. They don't care if that means they don't have power over their businesses. They want to be taken care of. They want to be provided for. And many of them simply want to have power to control other people. Yes. So they trade their own liberty for these phantoms and fantasies because they think they're getting something out of it. But here we have a constitutional republic, not a democracy, by the way, a constitutional republic where the representation of the people through their states is established for the sole purpose of securing the rights of the people, established for the sole purpose of controlling their creation, the federal government, so we don't become a kingdom again.
Right. And I'm glad that you mentioned that, because one of our questions from one of our attendees is, what is our system of government and why do you think that so many refer to it as a democracy?
We are a constitutional republic. And I believe, and I know that so many people refer to it as a democracy because that's what we've been teaching for, decades, 100 years or more. Why do we teach this? We teach this because we're not teaching it, because we put government in control of education, right? So why would the government teach us error? Well, because the ultimate and most, remember, James Madison said it was the greatest power on earth to control government. What government ever existing in the history of time anywhere on this planet would voluntarily teach its people the way that it has ultimate control over the government? Obviously, it won't. So when we put government in charge of teaching us about itself, error crept in, and they started teaching us error about who they are. Number one error, the federal government is supreme. Federal laws are supreme over state laws and state constitution. That is lie number one. Lie number two, we're a democracy. Why? Because democracies, which is the general term that we use democracy today, is the one voice, one vote, popular vote mentality, right? They teach us that because that's the greatest way to control the people. Because democracy is nothing more than mob mentality. And history and human nature proves that if you can convince the people that they are a democracy, then those in power, all they have to do is create a crisis over here, create an attraction over here, create a benefit over here, and you keep the mob chasing things, dividing them in separate corners, never unifying them in what is really unifying and powerful, the one thing we all share, liberty, and the need to control government. You get them over here chasing this government benefit. You get them over here fighting each other over the color of their skin. You get them over here fighting each other based on geographic differences and socioeconomic differences. You divide the people through hate, You divide the people through teaching that they are not the same, that they don't want to like each other. And you win this over through this tribalistic mentality of I'm on the red team and I'm on the blue team. Meanwhile, the people never understanding that they are absolutely unified in the single principle of liberty that is the single greatest threat to government that has ever existed. Wisdom and knowledge of the people in their liberty to control their government.
You make a great point there. You talk about how the government always tries to keep us divided, and they give us this benefit and this crisis. Juvenal said in AD 100 that if you give the people bread and circuses, they will never revolt. And that's exactly what they're doing to us today. And the way you describe it there was just perfect, and it made me think of that old quote. I want to go back a little bit. One of our listeners had a question for you. You were talking about how we don't have constitutional rights. We have these inalienable inherent rights. But his question is, do those rights extend to non-U.S. citizens? And the reason that this strikes a chord for me is that just recently, a town where 30 minutes from my original hometown, South Haven, Mississippi, the police shot a man there in 2017 and killed him. And the city is now saying that they don't owe any money because the family is filing suit because he was an illegal immigrant. So therefore, he does not have constitutional rights. So do non-U.S. citizens have constitutional rights or inherent rights?
Every human being on the planet has inherent rights. The problem that we have in America is distinguishing first what is the difference between rights and benefits, and what rights are essential natural rights, and what rights stem from the benefits of law. So a lot of things that we refer to today as rights are simply not actually rights at all. They're either legally licensed benefits or benefits that are derived from the nature of citizenship. So we have to understand the distinction in the difference between a right and a benefit. A right is something that you possess, whether government exists or not. Life, liberty, the right to secure your property, the right to defend those things. Everything else is outside of that realm. Samuel Adams wrote in his essay, The Rights of the American Colonists in 1772, that all laws of man must submit to these laws of nature, because the right to life, liberty, to property, to defending your life, your liberty, and your property all stem from the first law of nature, a duty of self-preservation. So what we are confused about in America is what a right is. You do not have a right to health care. Okay, that is simply not a right. That is a benefit. If government can hand it out and they can ascribe to it the conditions upon receipt, it is not a right. It is a benefit. And so that's really the main difference. Once the American people understand these differences, we used to teach this. When our founders had education, and prior to the Reformation that happened in the mid 1800s, we actually used to teach these things. And people had a firm understanding of property rights, had a firm understanding of natural rights. That's all been educated out of the American psyche. We have all, and what's crazy is because of this lack of education, we have all but destroyed the principle of property rights in America. I wonder, how many people actually realize that in America, nobody owns property anymore?
Okay, this will be interesting.
Yeah, so think about it. Let's give you the ultimate scenario, all right? You bought a piece of land, you built a house, you paid off your mortgage, you owe no bank any money on your land, okay? You fail to pay your property taxes for 3 years. What happens to your land? The government will seize your land for failure to pay property taxes. That single fact, because 3 years cumulative of missed property taxes is not the equivalent of the value of your real estate. So they're not actually taking your property in compensation for failure to pay taxes. What they're doing is they're evicting you from the property they feel they own because you have failed to pay the government rent. That's what property taxes established, that no one in America owns land. We rent land from the government.
Wow. That's an excellent point. And it's not a way I've thought of that before, but you're right. If they can take your land from you, that's definitely, you don't own that land for sure.
Well, think about it even further. Can you build on your property without getting permission from government? I mean, one of the essential principles of property ownership is that you have the liberty to do with your property as you will, and its only limit is you cannot harm or control the right of another. So if you can't build on your property without getting a permit, my goodness, some people in communities can't even catch rainwater on their property without government permission. All of these are just compilations of evidence of how we don't own property anymore. And I'll tell you, without hesitation and with complete boldness, that all of these deviations, this surrendering of our inherent natural rights and liberties are because of our failing education. Let me give you a quote from Samuel Adams. He said, "No people will tamely surrender their liberties nor be easily subdued when knowledge is diffused and virtue is preserved. But on the contrary, when the people become universally ignorant and debauched in their manners, they will sink underneath their own weight without the aid of foreign invaders." And what's really cool is everything that we've been talking about so far is a separate course at Liberty First University. I have a separate course on property based on Samuel Adams' essay on property, based on James Madison's essay on property written in 1792. We have a class on the origins of liberty, the natural rights of it, how they come not from government, but they come by the nature of our creation. I am a Christian and I make no question about that. But I will tell you, as someone who understands liberty, you have the liberty to not believe the way I do. And even if you do not believe that my God gave you liberty, you must admit that there is a higher power that has given you right, that has given you liberty, that is not government. Because the moment anybody, whether it be God or your higher power, is not the author of your liberty, but government is the author of your liberty, then government becomes your God, government becomes your king, and government becomes your controller. Whoever hands out the liberty also can take it away.
That's fascinating because I'm a former Christian minister many years ago, and I see that you mentioned that even unpopular speech must be protected, and whether that's unpopular Christian speech or unpopular atheist speech or whatever, Antifa speech or whatever that speech may be. You say that speech must also be protected if we're going to have a true right to freedom of speech.
Well, absolutely, because the goal of society should be the acquisition of truth. And you cannot discern a lie from the truth if you prohibit certain speech. Popular speech needs no protection. We don't need to keep the government from controlling popular speech because it's popular and government works on popular opinion. We need to prevent the government from controlling unpopular speech. I mean, think about it. At one point in time, an entire society believed that the sun orbited the earth, which was called heliocentrism. Galileo said, no, that's not true. We actually orbit the sun. And he was condemned legally by the government for making that challenge of truth. And this also ties into this understanding of understanding what rights really are, what liberty really is. You see, a right to freedom of speech, the right to freedom of religion, as it were, is not the freedom to be religious. The right to freedom of religion is truly a right of freedom of conscience, to believe or to not believe without government intrusion. And control of speech is a control of thought. And when the government controls thought by coercion, by force, by condemnation, by penalty of law or death, then no single human being is free, because it's the greatest form of oppression that exists. When you cannot hold on to your property unless you speak what the government agrees. You're going to be, if you speak out in opposition to the government and they come steal your property, human nature, that natural law that says you have a right to survive, kicks in. You will say or not say whatever you need to say or not say in order to hold your property, because property is an essential element of life. When you can't oppose government, when you can't disagree with government, when you can't disagree with the majority in society, history and human nature says you will enslave yourself with the worst kind of shackles, the mental ones that you cannot see. And they're the hardest ones to free yourself from, the self-imposed slavery.
Wow. Fascinating. So, and I guess herein lies the question, how do we stop this? We have the Second Amendment, of course, which is one of my favorites because, in my opinion, it protects the rest of them. I never, from the moment I wake up to the moment I go to bed, I have my handgun on me. I always go armed no matter where I am. Is that the answer, or what is the answer?
Well, I hope you don't mind, but I'm going to disagree with you on one point.
Okay.
It is not the second that protects the rest.
Okay.
And I want to ask you a question. Are you familiar with the incident that happened with the Weaver family at Ruby Ridge?
Of course. Yes. Disgusting.
Okay. Yes. So are you also familiar with the incident that happened on the Bundy Ranch not too long ago?
Yes.
Well, let me show you. Both of those situations were based on the same circumstances. Federal government usurping the rights of the people. It was a dispute over property rights. The difference between those two situations, because the situation with the Weaver family ended tragically, much different than the Bundy Ranch situation ended. And I will tell you that the distinction in those two situations is not guns. Because the Weaver family had guns. They had guns at the Bundy Ranch. The distinction between those two situations was the power of communication, the First Amendment. You see, because everybody there had a cell phone, everybody there had a way to communicate, then the people came and joined in unison, in liberty, in defense of each other. The Weaver family did not have that ability to communicate and call people into their defense. The First Amendment is first on purpose, because it is our way to peaceably assemble. It is our way to petition the government for a redress of our grievances. It is our way to unite in the principles of liberty, which is the foundation of our constitutional republic, so we don't have to stand alone like the Weaver family did. So it's actually the liberties of the First Amendment that protect all the rest. And I'm a student, I'm sort of a hobbyist in anthropology, so I love cultures and I love history. And I was a Russian linguist in the U.S. Army. Part of what we did was not just simply study the language, but we had to study the culture. And you search this out in history, you will find that when the Marxists or the communists or the dictators take over a community, they don't start by taking the guns. The guns are the last things to go, because the first thing to go is you control the land. Once you control the land, then you control the speech of the people, because the people will shut up to keep their land, to keep their food, to keep their means of living. Once you've controlled the voice of the people, then you can go in and take the guns, because they can't communicate with each other, they can't join together, and they dare not say anything against you. And what's interesting, that's exactly what happened in the Russian Revolution, and that's exactly what's happening in America. You've got an attack on freedom of speech and freedom of conscience. They haven't come after our guns, as it were, by showing up on our porch to confiscate them, but they have talked us out of our guns already through gradual deception and the belief that the government has a lawful authority to license what should be a natural right. We've been talked into that intellectually because they've controlled our speech, because they've controlled our education, and because they've controlled our property.
Fascinating. You're obviously very passionate about this. I'm really enjoying this very much. Thank you for joining us with this. So I'm going to start taking some questions from.
Yes, please.
We have lots of questions coming in. So this one is from Mark, and he says, I've heard you talk about and understand what the Constitution says about who holds the power of the purse, the House.
Mm-hmm.
But do we have any early documentation of the House and only the House making and passing any budgets? Can we say, look, they said it here, they explained it here, and they did it as a matter of practice? Do you know?
Absolutely, because prior to the Reformation of America in the mid-1800s, that's exactly how it worked. James Madison was already explaining. First off, we have proof of it because those who ratified the Constitution during the debates explained how this is supposed to work. Liberty First University, I have a course on the power of the purse where I actually go through the historical documents that explain that the intent in creating the federal government in the way it was is to secure that only the House of Representatives is in charge of the spending and the budget. And Madison said very clearly that the power of the purse is the most powerful source in the hands of the people to control their government, which is why we vested that power in the House of Representatives alone, because they are the direct representatives of the people. Not because of the representatives' relationship with the people, but because of the people's relationship with their representative. You see, you have to understand, Congress throws the number of representatives that are in the House of Representatives unconstitutionally. In the 1920s, they were supposed to reapportion the House. We're supposed to have a representative for every 30,000 people. We don't, okay? And so they froze that, which acted in a way to diminish the power of the people in their direct representation, which is why your congressman can simply ignore you because they have so many people yelling at them. They're going to find the group that agrees with them or likes them that will reelect them, okay? And so Madison said, and he was joined in agreement by the other delegates that, look, this has to be vested in the hands of the House alone because the people have to have control over the power of the purse. It's the greatest source of power to control government. It's interesting because Thomas Jefferson even made that statement in 1775 when he was defending the American colonists' refusal to pay their taxes after Lord North had issued this public condemnation of the colonists who were refusing to participate in the Stamp Act. And Jefferson wrote a rebuttal in 1775 and said, look, this power of the purse in the hands of the people is so powerful, we ought never surrender that authority. You can also read in Article 1, Section 8, that it says that the Senate may offer amendments as in other bills. That word may is permissive. It means they don't have to. The Senate is not supposed to have any control over the budget. They can offer suggestions, they can offer amendments, but the structure of the Constitution, as it's established, says that the House doesn't have to take the Senate's amendments. They don't have to listen to anything the Senate says. They are controlling the spending and the taxing, which is functionally the budget. And what we don't understand as well is that the president does not have a veto authority over the budget. Because you see, Madison explained that the power of the purse vested in the House of Representatives, one of the reasons it was there was, number one, so the people could control the government. Number two, so the House of Representatives could control the other branches of government and keep them from becoming bloated. Okay, so what sense would it make to say that the budget is a control on the office of the president to keep the executive branch from becoming bloated if the office of the executive can veto a budget and hold it hostage until he gets all the money that he wants?
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. And you mentioned the representation size going from 30,000 to, I guess it's somewhere around 700,000 per rep
Yeah.
these days. That's one thing I love about being here in New Hampshire is that ours averages one rep to about every 3,000 people.
Mhm.
So I love that. And
Yeah,
absolutely, if we're going to have a constitutional republic, we need to get those numbers down completely.
absolutely. And we
So,
also need to restore the power of the Senate by repealing the 17th Amendment and reestablishing in the understanding of the American people that the purpose of the Senate is not just simply another House of Representatives. The purpose of the Senate was to be a representative of the states in the federal government. That's why the Senate works in tangent with the president in foreign affairs, because we had to make sure the treaties and the government appointments were representing the states, not the people.
right, absolutely. So Matthew asks, let's go to Adam C. He asks, how do you address that those who argue that the Constitution isn't valid, since there's no one alive today that actually consented to it, even the states, the representatives of the states? This was an argument made by Lysander Spooner that, no individual person actually signed the Constitution. So how are they contractually bound to it?
Well, because you have to understand that the people themselves didn't ratify the Constitution. The ratification of the Constitution is not based on popular vote of the people. So it was not on the signatory power of the people. The ratification of the Constitution was based on the states. States are still in existence. And because the states are the parties to the Constitution remains a contract between the states and those who are still the members of the Union. So because, and that's kind of where that error comes in, when people say, well, the Constitution is an agreement between the people. Well, it's not an agreement between the people. The people were not the signatory on this contract. The states were on the contract. And so the states are the parties to the contract. Their continual existence creates a continual contractual relationship.
Great. So since the Constitution, confirms the rights that we have, these rights, is it required for citizens to do anything to claim them? And this question comes from Matthew. For example, when a person says, if you don't vote, you don't have any rights. Do you think that this is true?
No, absolutely not. We don't have to. That's the whole nature of having an inherent right. If you think that our rights come from government, then you think we have to do something to earn them. But we don't have to do anything to earn them. But I will say that is a legitimate point in the fact that doing nothing functionally surrenders them to the majority will or those in power, right? So the requirement of eternal vigilance within government is the requirement that the people remain active and diligent so that we remain a people who are still in control, right? We are, we're government created by the people, who derives its just power from the consent of the governed. Well, if the people are silent, then their silence is consent to whatever the government wants to do. And so it's essential in that. And it's, some people will say, well, that's just semantics. It's not just semantics. Like I said, the Constitution is what our founders called a parchment barrier. It's a piece of paper with ink on it. It does not limit, it does not control, it does not confine. Only the people can limit and control and confine their government. The Constitution just simply gives us a written framework to know when the federal government is outside of its boundaries, right? The distinction between a written agreement and a banana republic is that the government can tell you it's their power and you have to believe them because they say so. Our government can't just simply tell us, oh, it's our power because it says so, because we have actually the standard in writing and we can check that power to that standard, but we have to hold them to it. And by the way, you had asked me before, we got away from that, and it lines up with this question. Voting is not how we control government. So that's why I sort of laughed. If you don't vote, you consent. Well, voting is not how you control government. Voting was never the mechanism by which we control government. Voting is what you do when you're a citizen of a constitutional republic to ensure that your voice is being accurately conveyed in legislative matters. The control of government comes every other day of every other year, when you're in the face of your county commissioner, when you're in the face of your city councilman, when you're in the face of your sheriff, your state legislator, your governor, and your congressman, dictating to them that they must remain within the confines of natural rights. And that's why the greatest check and balance is not voting. See, that's the deception, the whole one voice, one vote kind of thing, and everybody get out to vote so you participate in government. That's not how you participate in government. That's the deception. That's why Americans feel powerless. That's why they feel overwhelmed. That's why they feel ignored, because we've been taught forever that the only control we have is voting them in or voting them out, which we don't do anymore anyway. The real control is in the establishment and the construct of our constitutional republic, where the people control their states and the states control the federal government. So you don't have to stand alone.
Wow, great. So going back a couple of questions, we have a question from David, and he talks about the 700,000 representatives, or people to one representative. In your opinion, his question is, should we increase the size of Congress so that we get smaller districts and aren't so disenfranchised? And with that being the case, we would have, 1,000 people in the House of Representatives, or even more?
Yeah, well, this is definitely a problem that needs a great deal of conversation and thought, because when our federal government was created, people always say, the Constitution has to be a living, breathing document because our founders didn't know this, that, or the other. That is also a lie and a deception. Our Constitution is a contract. It is not a living, breathing document. It is a contract that works under contract law. And what's interesting is I actually got into this Twitter debate with a lawyer, right? Who said, it's absolutely absurd that you go back on this contract construct of the Constitution. Everybody knows that the Constitution is a living, breathing document, and you are a fringe radical nut job because you don't buy into that too. I said, well, that's really interesting that you have that opinion about contracts, that contracts are a living, that they are unstable and they're wavering, and that the living, breathing document thing gives you a better understanding. I said, let me ask you a question. Would you be willing to consider your employment contract as a living, breathing document? Not what you meant when you signed it, in the negotiations of your employment, but what your employer actually wants it to mean today.
Absolutely not.
and the interesting thing is, on Twitter at that moment, things go silent and they block you and you don't hear anymore when they don't have an answer. So that's the one thing that we really, really have to understand, this whole, that our founders did not misjudge. But what I can say is that they did not anticipate was the growth of population. I don't think that culturally that was something that they could really understand. They envisioned, let me just put it this way, they envisioned technological advances. They envisioned growth, but in their limited experience of growth and technological advancement, they couldn't really get that. Now, that is not me saying that the Second Amendment only carries muskets, okay? So don't take me there. That's not what I'm talking about. But what I'm thinking, my personal opinion is this, that we've gotten too big for this Washington, D.C. thing. And so we've got to figure out how this whole new kind of growth actually works. Because if you actually have 30,000 representatives per person, right, then you have an entire city that simply houses the House of Representatives.
Right. And
so I'm not professing to you that I have the answers to that question, but I'm saying it's something that we need to address. And in addressing that, we cannot deny history, we cannot deny wisdom of government, and we cannot operate on the ideology that we're a democracy and get the right answers.
So this is a question coming from me. Does that mean that the country may be just too big to work properly? Do we need to see the country maybe split up, or see some secession movements of different regions? Because obviously we're a very diverse nation. We have different diverse regions that have different diverse beliefs. What are your thoughts on that?
And there's some very popular opinions that I think have a rational basis in thought in that kind of thing. Like I said, but I don't really have the answer to that. It's a little bit outside of my wheelhouse.
Okay.
You know, my expertise is teaching the Constitution in its existence, in its intent, in its formation.
Gotcha.
So
Okay.
beyond that, I would like to have that discussion with people, but that's not something that we teach at Liberty First University. And I would love to have some very brilliant minds, maybe, you know, more brilliant than mine, come together and talk about that. Because, you know, inevitably we're going to have these discussions one day.
Sure, absolutely. So here's a question from Sarah. She says, I live in California where the governor just passed SB 276, mandatory vaccinations. My daughter cannot now attend the University of California, Irvine without getting vaccinated. My grandson will not be able to attend school unless he is vaccinated. Can you talk about the mandatory vaccination issue?
I can. I actually have an article on my website, krisannehall.com, KrisAnnehall.com, titled Religious Liberty in Jeopardy over vaccination mandates. I don't know if that's exactly the title, but that's pretty much the premise of it. And what we need to understand is that these mandatory vaccinations are simply, I mean, you can make the argument they're not based in medical fact, they're not based in statistic. I will leave that to those experts. But I will tell you from a liberty standpoint, they are very contrary to liberty, and it's that Adam that Benjamin Franklin said, anybody who would trade temporary security for liberty will soon have neither. And so what you have now is a situation where no longer do you have freedom of conscience because the government is mandating injections beyond your conscience. I can tell you my undergraduate degree is in biochemistry. From a biochemical standpoint, I have a lot of personal objections to vaccinations. And from a Christian standpoint, I have a lot of personal objections to vaccinations built on the cells of aborted fetal tissue. That is contrary to my conscience to inject in my child's body the cells of aborted babies. And when the government mandates that is not only control on my body, that is a control on my conscience. And that ought to be the kind of perspective that we take in that. But we also have to understand that the government is taking control over aspects of our life that just simply are not lawful. Our government should not be involved in education or mandating or subsidizing education. Our government should not be involved in healthcare or mandating subsidizing healthcare. Our government should not be telling us what we can eat, what we can drink, what we can smoke, what we can ingest, what we can put on our bodies, what we can grow on our property. That is not a lawful authority of government. That is contrary to every principle of liberty.
Absolutely. Mark says in the chat, preach, and you are absolutely doing it. That's beautiful. Well done. So just one more quick question, and then we'll let you kind of talk about LFU and how people can get to it.
Okay.
So going back to the Second Amendment, that can the Second Amendment be limited to protecting only the ownership of small arms? For example, could weapons of war, such as automatic weapons, tanks, or even nuclear weapons, are those covered under the Second Amendment?
Yeah, absolutely, they are. When you understand the history and the principles of the Second Amendment, when you understand the reasons that it was written. At Liberty First University, we have several courses that actually address this. We have one specifically on the history, the establishment, and the principles of the right to keep and bear arms. We also have an amazing course that I really love, one of my favorites, called America Disarmed, where I take you through an actual event of history where one governor in 1774 disarms one town, and how that changed the course of not only our revolution, but the course of the world and the writing of our Constitution.
Wow, just I've got to check that one out.
Yeah. So just as a little hint, James, was it James? No, it was Noah Webster said that the right to keep and bear arms cannot be limited because it is the way of the people to control the government, right? He actually said, and we teach this in the court, I'm paraphrasing his quote because I don't have it in front of me right now, but he actually said that the government cannot raise any force under any pretense to impose or usurp the rights of the people, because the people, the whole body of the people, not a select militia, but the whole body of the people will possess arms superior to that of any government that can, and any force that can be raised by the government. So the essentials in the Second Amendment is, number one, it does actually, the subject of the Second Amendment is the people, not the militia, and that it has to be based on the right of the people to keep and bear arms, to control government, not to protect yourself from robbers and rapists or to go hunting.
Wow. All right, so that basically kind of wraps it up. We've got about a minute left. If you want to tell people how they can, sign up for Liberty First University and where they can go to do that.
Absolutely. LibertyFirstUniversity.com, LibertyFirstUniversity.com. You can go there. We have lots of subscription plans that you can use. If you are a student or you have students in your house, that's middle school, high school, college students, we have a reduced membership fee. This is an education that is worthy of the highest institutions of learning. This is not me with a camcorder, okay? This is actual, professional studio filmed and edited stuff with handbooks and stuff that you can actually learn from at a level that everybody can understand. Because I realize that our education on the Constitution has been co-opted since 1833. So we have to get back to basics. And this education, as Samuel Adams said, is the key to restoring our constitutional republic. So that's what really makes me passionate about this, because I don't want my son to grow up in a democracy where he actually has to fight government for his liberty again. I want to be the one who actually passes on to my children the gift of liberty as I'm supposed to. And that has to come through education. I have a friend who says, the problem is the people don't know what they don't know. And we've got to change that.
Absolutely. KrisAnne, thank you so much. Again, for all the attendees and people watching after, that's LibertyFirstUniversity.com. I personally plan to go check out these myself. I definitely want to learn more about that. The governor who disarmed a town. That's fascinating. I've always been a student of history. I've not heard that one. So I'm looking for that. So KrisAnne, thank you so much for joining us, and thank JC for us as well.
I will.
And did you have anything else to say before you go?
I'm just so grateful for everybody to come on, and I would just simply give a call to action. Look, if you've enjoyed what you've heard today, share this. Share this, inspire others. Educate, equip, inspire. Knowledge is not power until it's activated, and that's what we need to do. We need to activate what we learn so that we can become a self-governing people again.
Excellent. KrisAnne, thank you so much, and thank you to all of our attendees, and have a great evening.
Thank you.